Let's get started on the homepage wrap up. So for this activity, you're going to finish up the homepage for the whitewater rafting website, and by the end of it, it will look like the wireframe. So you're welcome to use your creativity and put your own spin on it, but remember, it does need to look like the wireframe at the end. So as you're doing the activity, we're going to be following some of the concepts that we've already learned. So grid for positioning or other ways to position that we've learned. Margin, padding, we're going to be using different ways to select items, so the descendant selection. Line height we experimented with in week 5, I believe. And then also pseudo classes you're going to be using to style links. So if you need to review any of those, the links are right here. Okay, we have made a lot of improvements to our page over the last few weeks. This week we finally take on the layout. After we finish the layout of the page, it should look very similar to the website or the wireframe and will be close to complete. So review the wireframe for the dry ore site. So let's take a look at that. So again, we know we're going to have this navigation bar on the top with the logo, the home page, and then the two child pages. And then we have our banner image, some text, another image, some text, more text at the bottom, and then our footer that has our copyright and our social media images. Okay, the instructions below are expecting a certain structure in your HTML to work. If you followed the instructions in the Getting Started activity, you should have it. It will look similar to the following. So I'll take a look at that in a second, but let's check out this Getting Started activity. So the Getting Started activity is the creating the home page in HTML, which talks about the structure of the page. So you're going to want your structure to match this if you want to be able to follow these instructions. It is okay if you do your activity a little bit different, as long as it looks like the wireframe at the end. However, if you want to follow these instructions, your markup will need to look like this. So let's check out what I have. So here we have our main tag. And if I look in my code, I can see my main tag right here. Here's my main tag. Here's my closing main tag. And so within it, I should have a div with the class banner box. And it does have a class banner box. And then the image inside of it. Then I should have a div with the class of home grid, which I have. And then I should have an H2 heading with the class of home headline grid, or home headline 1. And then a paragraph with the class of home paragraph 1. And see, mine does not, so I'm going to need to fix that. Home paragraph 1, there we go. With the text inside of it. And then we should have another div with the class of home right image, and then have the image inside of it. So I just have my image right here. So I'm going to switch this up and have it match the markup. So I'm going to remove that class from my image and instead create a div. And then, well, real fast, I'll have the div. I'm going to put that class on there. Oop. Okay. Oop. Sorry, my computer is behind. There we go. Okay, so now I'm copying that, and I missed my starting tag, so I'll just show you. If I copy and paste it right here, I noticed before that I was missing my starting tag, so now I have an error, and it says special characters must be escaped. So I'm kind of confused. Why does it say special characters might be or need to be escaped? It's because I am missing my starting tag. So there we go. Now that part looks like it. So I have my div with the home right image class on it with my image inside it. And then my H2 with the class home headline 2. My paragraph with the class home headline. See, that says home headline 2, and that needs to say home paragraph 2. And then again, I'm going to need to wrap this image inside a div. So let's grab that class and get a div. I'm actually this time, because I had a hard time copying and pasting my image, I'm going to take out that closing tag. And then now I'm going to put it in there. Okay. Okay, so we have our div around our image. And then lastly, we have our section with the class home paragraph -3, and it has an H2 and a paragraph inside of it. Okay, so my markup is looking similar to this. So again, right here, it just says make any changes necessary to have yours match what is above. The HTML only, your images can be different. So like they have their image in here. I have already picked out my images, and so I have those in there as well. Another thing I want to point out, so you saw that, you know, I had to change some of my markup to make sure it matched in here to be able to follow the instructions. Sometimes what I see from you guys is, right now, see how I have the class home headline -1. Sometimes you guys mix up classes and IDs, and you have like an ID of home headline 1, and then when you're following the instructions, it's confusing, like why aren't my styles applying? And it's because you're targeting in a class when you put an ID on it. So watch those classes and IDs. Okay, so now that we're all set up, we can start with step 1, which is the banner width. So first, let's consider the banner. According to the wireframe, it should extend all the way across the width of the page. Depending on which image you are using, yours may or may not be doing that. Let's set a width of 100% on that image. Find the div that contains the banner image. Okay, so here's my banner image, and here's my div that contains it as a class of banner-box. And that's exactly what it says right here. You should have added a class calling it something like banner-box. We can use that class to apply our width. So you might have tried something like this. So let's go to our styles.css and try that out real fast. Here, I'll just put it here. So we have our banner-box, and notice that I put a dot before it because this is a class. So dot for a class, and then we have width 100%. And now I can see my preview loading over here, and it still doesn't look like it's taking 100%. There's still a little space here. So let's talk about that. So to set the if you did, you will find that that didn't work, which is exactly what we found, right? So why not? So we applied the width to the element with a class of banner-box. Guess what? As a div, it already had a width of 100%. So what we need to do is apply the width to the image inside of the element with the class banner-box. Does that make sense? And I want to show you something real fast just to try to clarify this concept. So if we put background color on this, we'll just do blue. If I put a background color on that, and now this is going to refresh, you can see that we have the blue here. So I put the 100% width on that div, and the div is taking 100%, but the image inside the div is not. Okay, so we targeted the div, and now we need to target the image inside of the div. And we can get rid of that background color. And now you can see the image inside of that div is taking 100%. So we had to select the correct element in order to get that to apply. Okay, visualizing the grid. Now let's tackle the main portion of the site. We will be using the CSS grid you learned last week to accomplish this. The first step is to look at the wireframe and see if we can visualize how a grid, columns and rows, would fit around elements on the page. Open it up. You may even want to print it out and draw some lines on it. So let's open it up again. Okay, see, I already had it open, or I had it over here. However, this one, they drew some grid lines on it. So we can see we have a few columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. And if you remember, and if you print this out, you can write on it. But if you remember, we have, this is grid line 1, the starting line. Then we have grid line 2 is right here. Grid line 3, grid line 4, grid line 5, and grid line 6. So we have 5 columns, but we have 6 lines. Okay. Awesome. So in case your power of visualization are a bit rusty, you can see my results below for the columns. So this is what we were just looking at with the columns, the 5 columns. And it says here's another image sharing columns, rows, and gaps. And so here, this is just what we were talking about before. So we have, this is grid line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we have 5 columns. And then you can also see the gaps in here too. So we can also see that they have quite a few rows in here as well. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows, and then 8 row lines. And you can also tell that they are different widths and heights. Or no, different heights. The rows are different heights. The columns are all the same width. So we have that image as well, which is helpful. I'm going to leave that open because we might reference it later. Okay. Oh, I closed it. After I said I was going to have it open. There we go. It's still open. Okay. After you have a good idea of what the grid needs to look like, the numbers and sizes of rows and columns, which we now do, either by figuring it out on your own or by reviewing the 2 images, continue on to the next step. Okay, step 3, defining the grid. Let's try CSS Grid to do this. So here's a handy link for you if you are needing help with CSS Grid and want to reference it. I love to have references open while I code. So open this link and keep it handy. It's good when you have several elements that need to be placed into specific spots on a page. Before you start, you may want to review the portion on grid from the article you read last week, and here's a link to that. Locate the div inside of the main that contains most of our content. Okay, so let's go to our index, and here's our main, and here is our div that contains most of our content, because this other div is our banner, so this is our content here. You should have given it a class either like home-grid. Give it that class now if you didn't before. So here I can see it has the class home-grid. If you don't already have a rule in your CSS with that selector, add one now. Add the following property display grid to modify that section of your page to turn it into a grid container. In my case, that rule would look like the following. Okay. So we're going to do that too. And we're looking to see if I already have a home grid declaration. And I do. It's right here. So, because I put some padding on it. And now I'm going to do display grid. Okay, so I have grid on. So now all of the immediate children will become grid items or children. So let's take a look at the HTML again. So immediate children. So my H2 is going to be a grid child. My paragraph is a grid child. This div with the image is a grid child. Again, heading, paragraph, div, and then lastly section is a grid child. These H2 and paragraph elements inside of the section are not, because they are not immediate children of the home grid div. Okay, so next we need to define our columns. Above you should have found that this layout works best with 5 equally sized columns. To define this in grid, we use the grid template columns property. It is a property of the grid container, so we can add it to our home grid rule set. We don't know exactly how wide each column should be, only that they need to be equal. We can use this using the FR unit, and 1 FR equals 1 portion of space. So let's go back to our CSS. And again, on our home grid, we can do it right on the home grid. We can add grid template columns, and we are doing 5 equal spaced columns. So we are using the FR unit so that they are all equally spaced. And then it also talks about that we can use the repeat method from grid. So we can shorten it to repeat 5 1FR. And when we do that, repeat 5, we're telling it we want it to repeat 5 of whatever's next, and we want it to repeat just 1FR because we want them to all be the same amount. So we're going to repeat 5 1 fraction of the width, okay, or the space that's available. So you should see an immediate change once you define your columns. The browser will try to start placing items into cells. It will do this even though we have not defined any rows. Let's take a look. So here's my home page. And yeah, I can see that it's doing some funky stuff. So you can tell that it's starting to move things around because we have these columns set up. So let's talk about explicit versus implicit grids. Grids can be constructed either explicitly, where you define everything about the grid, column number, widths, row number, and heights, and where every item should be placed, or you can do grids implicitly. So that means that you let the browser make as many of the decisions as possible. Most grids are a mix of both. All grids need to have some columns defined, but after that, the browser will implicitly create rows as needed. If you review the layout with grid lines image above, you will see that the rows are not all the same height. You may have been wondering how you're going to make, or how to know how you, you may have been wondering how you are to know how big to make each row. So the secret is you don't have to know in most cases. You can let the browser figure it out. So let's take a look at that again. So again, we talked about that the rows are different heights. Like this one is taller than this one. And so we're going to let the browser figure out how tall they need to be. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, so my workflow when creating a new grid layout is usually the following. First, review my wireframe to begin visualizing the grid I need to make, which we did. The second is to define columns and then see how close I am to achieving my desired layout. And then third, we explicitly place items as needed. So again, the browser is going to place items into the grid based on how we define it. And so that's implicit placing of the items. And so we will only explicitly place items as needed. And then we can explicitly create rows if needed. Most of the time it's not needed. Sometimes it is. And if that's the case, then we do that. And then the last one is to adjust any alignment as needed. So the best advice here is to let the browser do as much of the work as you can. Step 4, place the items. In our layout, implicitly or automatically created rows will be just fine. But most of our items will have to be explicitly placed to get them into the right spots. Let's place the first together. So find the first headline. It should have a class of home headline 1. Okay, and here it is. Here's my heading with the class of home headline 1. If you don't have one with that class, be sure to add the class to it. Make a rule in your CSS for that class. Use the grid column and grid row properties to assign this item to a portion of the grid. If you review this layout image, which is, it's the one we just looked at actually, the wireframe that has more visuals on it. Okay, so if you review that image again, you will see that the headline is in row 1 and only needs 1 row of space. It also starts in column 1, but needs 3 columns of space to fit. To place it correctly in the grid, you could use the following. Okay, so I'm going to open that image. Okay, so see just what it's talking about. We're starting at line 1, going to line 4 with that image. It's taking up 3 columns. Okay, so to do that, we are going to go back into our CSS. And I don't have a declaration for it, so I'm going to do it just right below that H2. And I'm going to say home headline 1. Okay, so grid column 1/4. And again, with the 1/4, grid column 1/4, we're saying we want you to take up the space between line 1 and line 4 within our 5 columns. And then grid row 1/2. And so same thing there, we're saying we want it to take up 1 row, basically, between line 1 and line 2. So continue placing the rest of the items into the correct rows and columns. If your images are not resizing to fit in the box, you have to make, or you have them in, make sure you have the following rule in your CSS. Image max width of 100%. And so that makes sure that your images are never larger than the box that they are in. So let's do this real fast. Let's put it at the bottom. Okay, so now none of your images will spill out of their boxes. Okay, so you guys are going to have to place the rest of the items on your own. Okay, now with my images with the 100% width, my logo is crazy big. So you guys are going to need to work on positioning the rest of those items. This should be much easier after you have done the styling or the positioning activity last week. But for now, I'm going to move on to step 5, but you can pause this video and get started on positioning all of those items. Real fast before step 5 though. So I put that width on there. It needs to be max width of 100%. And that will actually fix what I had there before. So now my images aren't taking up 100%. We're just saying you can't get any bigger than 100% of the width. Okay, so I am going to pause this video and go in and position all my items, and you should do the same, and then we will move on to step 5 together. Okay, so I now have my home page, or the main content, pretty much in the same grid as the wireframe. It doesn't look exactly like it, but it's in the same general grid. I have them between the specific grid lines as outlined here. So let's take a look at the instructions again. So step 5 is the grid gap. Looking good. One thing is bugging me though. The headlines and paragraphs are in some cases squished up against the images. So you can see that right here. If you refer back to the layout image again, you'll notice some space between the columns and grids, or columns and rows. This is called a gap, and you can add it to the grid gap. Add it using the grid gap property. This is a property that gets applied to the grid container. So add a grid gap of 1em to your grid. So real fast, let's look at the wireframe, and you can see that gap right here. Okay, so let's go back to our CSS, and we are going to add that grid gap property to our container. Okay, and our container is, where's our container? The home content, I have it down here. Home grid, there we go. Okay, grid dash gap and we'll do 1M. Let's take a look. Okay, so now we can see that spacing between my text and those images. Step 6 is navigation. Check your header HTML. We've done a lot of work on our site over the last few weeks, and it's looking pretty close to the wireframe now. The next portion that needs our attention is the header. I have to admit, I'll be really happy when we get that big step. The code that I am basing this activity on looks like this, so you may want to adjust yours if it's not similar. Let's take a look at our navigation HTML. See if we need to change anything. Okay, so we're looking for the header HTML element. If I look in here, here's my header HTML element. Okay, there's a div with the class of logo box, which I have here, and then it has my logo inside. And then we have our nav element, and inside it has a UL, or unordered list, with several list items in it. So we have our home page, and then our 2 child pages, which for me is blog and FAQ. For you, it's probably different. And then they link to the About Me. I have my site plan in here. You can link to whatever other pages you want, or you can just have the 3 links there, which is what I'm going to do. So the top of the page looks like that. So if we take a look at mine, it looks pretty similar, right? Here's my logo and my list of links. Step 7, logo and navigation placement. Let's start with getting the logo and the list of links to line up in a row first. There are several ways we could do this, but since we are most familiar with grid, we'll use that. This is really just a simple grid with 1 row and 2 columns. The only tricky part is identifying which element will be the grid container and which are the grid items. We want to move the nav and logo box elements. Their parent is the header element. Let's take a look. So yeah, we have our logo and then our navigation elements inside the header. That is where we'll start. Create a rule targeting the header in your CSS if you don't already have one. Add the properties to turn on grid and define some columns. So how big should the columns be this time? We have a small issue. This time the columns will not be the same size. We know how big the column with the logo needs to be, the size of the logo, which is around 110 pixels, but we don't know the size for the navigation. We really just want it to be whatever's left. CSS Grid has an option to indicate that, and that's called Auto. So here's an example of how your header rule might look. So let's go into our CSS and do that. So do I have a header declaration yet? It doesn't look like it. I will just place it at the bottom of my file. Header. We're going to turn on grid. And then we are going to use grid template columns. And again, we're going to make our logo about 110 pixels. And then we want the rest of the space to be auto, because we want our logo to take up 110 pixels, and then we want the links in the navigation to take up whatever's left. So now our logo and link should look like they've moved into the same row. So let's take a look. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So we're pretty close to getting there. All right. So navigation link layout, step 8. Let's make our links flow across the page horizontally next. It's important to remind ourselves why they currently look the way they do. List items are block elements. So one way to make them flow horizontally would be to change them to inline block elements instead. But we also saw above the grid can be used to make columns act as rows as well. And we also gained some nifty alignment tools. Let's use that to lay out our navigation. Again, remember that for grid, we need to identify the items we want to move around. In this case, it's our LI elements, which is list items. Then find their parent. In this case, it's the unordered list. This parent is where we will put our display grid. Write a CSS rule using a selector to only affect the list items inside of the nav element and add that now. So we learned about several new ways to select elements with CSS previously in Khan Academy. One of them allows us to combine multiple selectors together. For step 1 above, we could use a simple UL as our selector, but that would change all lists on the page, and we may not want that. If we have the list somewhere else on the page, we would probably want them to look like a list and not be lined out next to each other. It would be better to get only the lists that are inside of a nav. We can do that by using nav space UL as our selector instead of just UL. Many of the steps of this activity will require similar selectors. So if you need to review selectors, that Khan Academy lesson is a great one. And there's also W3 Schools. If you Google W3 Schools CSS selectors, it's a really great resource. Okay, so I'll put it up here because I had one earlier where I was getting the links inside of the nav. So now I want to do nav space UL. So I'm getting the unordered lists inside the navigation, and I'm going to turn on grid. Okay, so we also need to define our columns. The easiest way to do this would be to count the number of items in our list and create that many 1FR sized columns. This would certainly work, but it's also a bit rigid. If some of you use our page on smaller screens, the links might start looking squished. What would be nicer is to have the browser define as many columns as will fit in the current width. And there's actually a way to do that. So let's take a look at the example below. So the NavUL, they have list style is none, and we're going to do that, and that actually removes those bullet points. So now they're a list, but they don't have that bullet point, making it look like a list. And then the next one they have is grid template columns, which we've used frequently, the repeat that we know, and then they use the auto fit property. And then they use a min-max property inside of it with the 6M and 1FR. So what does that mean, right? So let's break that down. And first I'm going to put that in my declaration here before we talk about that. So grid template columns repeat auto fit, and then we're going to use the min max 6M comma 1 FR, and then I need my semicolon at the end. Okay, so we're going to break that down. It uses the repeat method, but instead of giving a number of columns like in the past, we use the keyword autofit. This tells the browser to create as many columns as it can fit into the space available. Then instead of giving a specific size for each column, we use the min-max method. This tells the browser to create columns that are 1FR big, but no column can be smaller than 6M. So using a bit of math to illustrate, if we have 4 links and the browser window is currently 60M, which is about 960 pixels, 60M divided by 4 equals 15M. This is way bigger than the 6M, so we would get 4 equally sized columns, or 1FR, because that divides into equal space, of 15M. If the browser window size were only 20M, which is around 320 pixels, then 20M's divided by 4 would be 5M. So that's smaller than our minimum of 6M, so we wouldn't be able to fit them all into 4 columns. So instead it would create 3 equal columns on the first row and then 1 more on the second row. So why is 6M the minimum, you may be asking? Well, it's based on the length of the longest link, which is rates/dates. Any smaller than that and the words get squished if the text is rate/dates. So check out the length of your longest link and adjust the value up or down as necessary. So if you have if If your links have shorter text, you might be able to get away with like 5em or 4em, or so play around with that and find out what the width is of that. So before we move on to step 9, let's just take a look and see how this is looking so far. So we can see that my links are taking up the equal space up here, and that they're sitting next to the logo. So finishing up the navigation. The links are moving in the right direction now, but the alignment isn't quite right, and the row is a bit bigger than we want it to be. The row is easy to fix. It's actually caused by the unordered list we used for our links. Lists and many other elements have some default styling that comes with them. In this case, there is some margin automatically added to the top and bottom of the list that is causing us problems. So let's turn that off by adding margin 0 to our nav-ul rule. Okay. Margin 0. Our final issue, the links are aligned at the top of the row. They would look better if they were in the middle or the bottom. Vertical alignment in grid items is controlled with the align items property. So we can add align items center to our grid container. In this case, it would be the header rule to fix this issue. So real fast, let's take a look at our page. And yeah, so you can see there at the top. So we want to put them into the grid container, which again is our header. So let's take a look at this. Let me find my header rule, which is right here. So I have my grid on, and I have my grid defined. And so now I'm going to say align items center. Okay, and then they have some extra rules on their logo box, but we don't need to worry about that right now. And then we have our navigation. So let's take a look. Okay, see, so now they're centered. Do you see that? Before they were at the top up here, and now they're in the center. Step 10, adding link interaction. So our page is looking great, only a couple of tasks left. First is to address a usability issue. You should never make a user guess what elements are links and what aren't. We should give them plenty of visual hints. One thing we can take advantage of is pseudo classes. And there's a link here if you need to read more about them. So pseudo classes let us target specific states of elements, such as a link. Links have 4 states. Which is normal, which means nothing's happened, visited, which means the link has been clicked on, and active, which means the link is currently being clicked, and hover, which means the mouse is on the link but not clicking. The way we would change a link on hover is to add a rule like this. And then you do that, hover. And that's a pseudo class. Again, if you haven't read that link yet, pause this video and go check that out. So this will change the color of all links to green on hover. So let's set up some hover events to let our visitors know without a doubt that our nav bar is indeed a nav bar with clickable things. My example is going to stay simple, but you should refer back to your site plan to see how you plan to style your links. So real fast, I want to show you. So if I go to my site plan.html, I can see here's where I styled my navigation. So I can see that I chose green links and then to have them yellow with a green background on hover. Now if I want to change that, that's okay, but you should change it in your site plan as well. Okay, so, I lost my spot. So we're going to simply add an underline to the link on hover. So add another rule to your CSS that looks like nav a hover. So here's one of my other nav a rules. So now we're going to say nav a hover. And now what's happening here? So nav, we're saying, okay, the navigation bar. We want to select the navigation. And then we are saying, okay, we want to select links, which is the A element, anchor. We want to select the links within the nav. And then we use the pseudo class of hover to say we want to select the links inside the navigation bar when someone is hovering over them. Okay, so now we're going to add the text decoration of none. Well, so first let me show you real fast. So they're underlined by default, and when I hover over them, they're still underlined. So now we're going to do text decoration none. And now, see how the underline goes away when I hover on it? So that's what we're doing. Okay. So there are a couple of common things that can happen when you mouse over a link. You could do something very simple and just add or remove an underline on hover, which is what I just did to show you. You could also change the color of the link or text, or change the color or link and background. So refer back to your site plan, like we just talked about, and try a few different effects. Just remember the purpose. The purpose is to make sure the visitor knows that these are links. Notice, most of the time CSS doesn't care much about spaces. You can have them or not. Sometimes it does care though, and pseudo classes are one of them. So nav a hover will work just fine, but nav a hover, see that space I just added, does not work. So if we go back here, see now it's not doing anything. So watch for that. Okay, so you can style your hover to work however you want. You could have it go to a different color, or just like on our site plan, how it also had a different background. You can do that. Have fun with that. This is one of the parts where you get to be creative. Okay, so I'm pause this video, go ahead and do that, style your navigation however you want, and then when you're done, we'll move on to step 11. So step 11 is the footer. The next thing to do now is finish the footer. According to the wireframe, the copyright should be on the left and the social media icon should be on the right. The whole footer should be 55 pixels high, and there should be space around the icons. This is similar to what we have done before. You should be able to figure it out. So review the tips on last week's positioning activity if you get stuck. A hint, there are several ways to do this, but since we've spent most of our time with CSS Grid, I would recommend using that to get things into the right locations. Then use padding, margin, or width on the different elements in the footer as needed to finish it off. So step 11 you're going to do on your own. But again, let's take a look at the wireframe. You can see, just like it talked about, we'll move my face here for a second, it needs to be about 55 pixels high. And your copyright needs to be on the left, and your social media images need to be on the right and have some space between them. Okay. Step 12, enhancements. At this point, your site is mostly done. There is much that could be done to dress it up a bit though. From the list below, pick 2 items and follow the instructions to enhance your page. So here's the 4 things you could do, sorry. One is a snazzy logo, which has, you can see the rounded edges around the logo. Number 2 is a call to action. So on our sites, if we take a look, we just have the banner image, but you could add a call to action right here, which is just some text with a button. And then number 3 is these fancy headlines with those borders on them. And number 4 is this fun 3D image. So you need to pick 2 of those and go through those activities. And I am going to go through each of those so you can skip forward to whichever ones you want, or you can watch them all. So we'll start with the snazzy logo. So, okay, number 1, snazzy logo. The first enhancement option is to dress the logo up a bit. We can use a fun CSS property called border radius to create an effect that will make our logo look like the type or the top of an or. So check your HTML. The instructions will will expect your logo image to be inside of a div with a class of logo box, which We fixed our HTML at the beginning, so it should have that. So yeah, we have our div with the class logo box and then our image inside. And real fast before I continue, I do want you to check out this link about border radius. So pause this video and check that out and then come back. Did you do it? Hopefully. Okay, so if you check the link above, you will learn, which you should have paused this video and done that already. You will learn that border radius can accept 1, 2, or 4 arguments. We will use 4 arguments for ours. We want the top 2 corners rounded and the bottom 2 square. Create a rule in your CSS for the logo box class like this. Okay, so let's go to our CSS. And then we need to create a declaration for a logo box, and I'm checking to make sure I don't have one already, and I don't. So I'm just put one right here. Logo box. Again, remember it's a class, so I have my dot in front of it. Okay, so we're going to give it a background color of white. And then we're going to use the border radius property. And we're going to put in 4 arguments into it. So we're going to do 50 pixels, 50 pixels, and then 0, 0. And always end with our semicolon. So what does this rule do? It will set the top left and the top right corners of our logo to be rounded. So that's our 50 pixels right here is our top left and top right. But we're going to leave the bottom right and bottom left corners not rounded, which is the zeros here. Play around with these numbers a bit to get a feel for how border radius looks or works. So pause this video, play around with it, check out how things are working, and you can see how this is looking for mine. I feel like mine needs to have a little more height to look nicer with the logo that I am using, but you can play around with it and see what works for you. Okay, and actually it talks about this. So our logo image is currently not fitting entirely inside the colored shape. So we need to expand the shape a bit to make it fit. Padding is always a great way to make more space on the inside of the element. So let's add some. So we have padding. We're going to do 0.5 and see how that looks. And that actually looks better. So there's more space around it. Okay, so now the image is completely inside the shape. So feel free to experiment here as well and just figure out what you like best. One last thing that would be nice is to add a border around our new shape. So let's add a border to finish our logo off. Okay, so I'm going to add my border and I'm going to do shorthand and do 1 pixel. So my border will be 1 pixel wide and it's going to be solid. And let's see, they're using that color, but I want to use one of my site colors. Where are my... Oh, where are my colors? Let's see, what color do I want to do them? So I have my brown is the color of the text, and I think I'm going to use that brown. Okay, so use whatever color, fits your site. Let's take a look. And so that's that really thin 1 pixel. So again, you can play around with how much padding you want, how much space you want your logo to take up, and also how wide you want that border, if you even want one on there. So I like the 3 pixels. That looks okay to me. Okay, so that wraps up the first extra, I guess. So the extra enhancement option. So that's snazzy logo. Number 2, call to action. A call to action is usually something that stands out on a website. It fights for the user's attention and helps them to know what they should do next. In this case, what we would like our visitors to do is book a trip. Let's make a call to action to make that easier for our users. Your HTML should currently have a div with the class banner box like this. Your image can be different, so let's take a look at our HTML. And let's look for our banner box. So here's my div with the class banner box, and I have my image in there. So it looks right. And then we need to add some more content to that section. We need a headline and a button grouped together, something like this. So they have the image, and then there's another div inside the div that has the heading and the button. So let's do that over H3. And then we're going to put in plan your next adventure with us. And then we're going to add a button below it. It's going to say contact us. Okay. So now ours pretty much looks like that. Oh, except for I didn't add a div. So let's wrap those in a div. Whoop. Okay, let's grab those elements, put them inside my div, and then add the class called action. Awesome. Okay, if you refer to the image at the top of this page, you will see that the call to action needs to have a few things done to it. So let's look at that real fast. So this is the call to action. Okay. So what is it saying we need? It should have a semi-transparent background color. So we want to be able to see some of the colors of the background come through. But the text should also be readable. The headline styling should match that of the rest of the page, the color, font, etc. Whatever it is you're using, it needs to match. And then the button should be big and bold because we want to catch the user's attention. Use a color from your color palette. So again, you created your site plan, you came up with a color palette, use those colors. The text and button should be centered and then have enough white space to look good. Think padding and margin. The other thing is it needs to be placed on top of the banner image, on whichever side it looks better. For the banner image I chose, it looks better on the left. So let's actually look at mine. Oh, I think it could look good on the left or the right, or even the center for the image I chose. But you'll know what will look best with the image that you chose. But if you look at the banner that they chose, because they have these rafts right here, it looks better on the left. Okay, so for colors, we have been using hexadecimal codes, but this is not the only way to indicate color in CSS. You can also use RGB, which you should have used in your Khan Academy lessons and should be familiar with. So light gray and RGB, for example, would look like this. So yeah, RGB, and then we have 240, 240, 240 within those parentheses, separated by commas. So there's also another version of the RGB method, which is RGBA. It takes 4 numbers, and the last one indicates how transparent your color should be. It will be between 1 and 0. So let's use this to give our element a semi-transparent background. Make a rule using the action class. Okay, so we're going to go into our CSS and then create a rule for our action class. So dot, because it's class, or except I wrote a comma. We're going to actually write a dot this time. And then action. Put that there, and then we're going to do the background color and use the RGBA. And then do 240, 240, 240, and then 0.8. So that we'll show you what that looks like. So you can see they're not quite lined up yet, but it's a really light gray, and it's actually a little bit transparent. That's what that 0.8 is, because again, that fourth argument can be between 1 and 0 for how transparent it is. So I also want to show you a cool tool that I like, and if you look up W3 Schools RGBA picker, color picker, then you come to this HTML color picker here. And you can pick different colors. So let's say, on here we have a light gray background, but let's say I wanted like my light yellow. So I'm gonna actually look at my CSS real fast and find where that background color is. And here, I think that's my yellow that I like, or that I'm using on my site. And so I'm going to enter the color value here. Here we go. Press OK. And so now here's my color. And so that's my hex color, but now I can see the RGB code for it. And so if I copy that, I can go into my CSS and back down to the action where I was defining the background color. And I can paste it in there. So now I have the RGB, but again, we need a little bit of transparency, so we can put in the A, and then we'll do like 0.8 for now for the transparency. And then you can see when that changes. And now, so you can see this is the same yellow color, but it's a little bit lighter because it's a little more transparent. And you'll be able to see that once we get them stacked. Okay. So moving on. Next, we need to make our button really stand out. So try the following rule as a starting point, but feel free to adapt it to your liking, especially with color. And that's one of the things that I just showed you. So you can make it work for you however you want. This is where you get to be creative. So have fun with it. Okay, so let's start with what they have. Line height of 2M. We already have the background color, a width of 10M, and then font size 1.2M. So this should all be things you're familiar with, but if you have any question about what any of those lines are doing, then change them and just see what changes and what happens. So selectively breaking and then fixing things is a great way to learn HTML and CSS. Next, we should add some padding and margin to our element. Things are feeling pretty smushed as they are currently, so we'll try this as a starting point. So real fast, let's take a look at it. So yeah, it does look pretty smushed. Okay, so we have our background color. And now, okay, so we're going to add some margin. 1M and 3M. And then we'll do some padding of 1M. And so the padding is the space inside of the box. And then we're going to text align center. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so now you can see there's like some more space in there. There's space around my box. That looks a little better. I would probably make my box a little wider, so you can play around with that and, make it however you want to make. Okay, so I slipped the centering in that CSS, or in that set of CSS as well. So at this point, your element should be looking pretty good. The next step is to position the call to action on top of the banner. So we have seen that CSS grid can be used to position overlapping elements, so let's use that. So our grid container will be the banner box div. Again, let's take a look at that. It's my index file. So we have our banner box and it has the image and our div. So yes, the banner box should be the parent of both of those items. So let's go back to our CSS. So we need a new rule setting up grid. In this case, we really only need 2 columns equally sized. So add the following rule. So we're going to turn on grid and then add 2 equally sized columns. So real fast, I'm going to search for banner box to make sure I don't have any rules for it. And if you didn't see what I did to search that file, I hit on my Mac it's Command F. If you're using Windows, it's Control F, and you can search within files. So if I search home-grid, I can see that there's my home grid, and I can move through if there were more items in the file. So I didn't find any that used banner box, so I'm going to create a new one, and again we're going to turn on grid and then create those 2 equally sized columns. Okay. So now all that's left is to place the 2 grid children, which those grid children are, you know what they are? They're the banner and then that div that has the call to action in it. So the background image should be in row 1 and should span both columns. The call to action should also be in row 1. We only have 1 row. And it should be in column 1 if we want it to the left, and column 2 if we want it on the right. Use the grid column and grid row properties to place these elements on our grid. At this point, your CSS should look something like this. You should replace the colors with your colors, and you may need to adjust the padding, margin, and font size to make it work in your page. So again, I know I've said this a lot, but this is your time to be creative. So use those colors that you picked in your site plan and colors that you love, and just make this your own. So let's get this set up. So I want to target the image that's inside of the banner box div. So if this looks confusing to you, you might want to read that article on CSS positioning again. And then we're going to set up the grid column, and we're going to say 1/-1. And just like it says in this comment here, the -1 is just a fancy way to say span all of the columns. And then for grid row, we only want 1 row, so we're going to say grid row 1. And then for our action, we are going to say grid column 1 if we want it in that first column, and then grid row 1 because we only want 1 row. So let's take a look at this. And here's what it looks like in that first column. And now if I wanted it in my second column, then I could say grid column 2 and see how it moved over there now. So I'm going to leave mine in the first column, but you can put yours wherever you want it. And then here's a great example of some button styling. So because that button, again, if we look at it, still looks pretty plain, just like the normal button you get when you use an HTML button. So we're going to style it. So action, we're going to target the button that's inside of that action div. And then we're going to do line height of 2M. And you don't need to copy this exactly. You should really be doing what you think looks best. This is just a good place to start. So play around with these elements to figure out what looks good to you. Background, color, and here's a good time where you should be using a background color that you really like. I'm just going to say green because I don't want to look for my hex color. And then font size of 1.2M. Okay, and so let's look at how that's looking. So this does not look good on my site because the button is way too big for the space that I have here. So there's some work that I need to do on this. I'm not going to, because this is really where you need to take over and style your site accordingly. So have fun with this and figure that out. I will show you one other thing that you could do if you want, and that's we can use some pseudo classes on this button. So button hover, so if we want to say on hover, background color, let's say brown. Actually, that's not going to show up very well. We'll do teal. Again, use your site colors if you're going to do this. So we have our button, and then when I hover on it, now it's teal. But another thing, and again, this is totally optional, but if you want to go the extra mile, this is something fun to add. So when I hover over it, you can see the cursor looks the same, whereas like when I hover over these links, it looks a little bit different, like it looks like you can click on it. And so if you want to make your button look like you can click on it, then you can use a property called cursor and the value of pointer on hover. And so now our cursor changes to the pointer cursor on hover. So have fun with that. Style this how you want to, but that should get you started on how to do this extra enhancement. Number 3, fancy headers. Headlines are a fun way to dress up your site. We often stick with the default solid style, but there are many more styles to choose from. So let's check out this link. And so this talks all about border. So go ahead and check that out and pause this video and come back. So for this example, I will use the double border style, but look through the list at the link and experiment. Adding a border to your headlines is pretty straightforward, but in this case, I don't really want a border all the way around, but just on the top and bottom. And that can be done with border top and border bottom properties. So I'm scrolling up so we can look at the wireframe again, and so you can see they have that border on the top and on the bottom. Let's scroll back down. Okay, so we have our H2s here. So again, we're going to look into our HTML. And yeah, so we can see I used H2s. If you used a different element, you'll need to target a different element or change your HTML. So going into your styles, we have the H2, and I used to have a declaration for it, but I took it out, so I'm just going to do it at the bottom. H2 border top 5 pixels and then double, and then border bottom 5 pixels double. Let's take a look at that. And so you can see you have 2 lines in there, so it's a double border. So it says I needed 5 pixels before I could see that there really was a double border. So you should also add some padding to give your new headlines a presence as well. So 5M worked well for me, which is the person writing these instructions. And so experiment with different styles, border widths, padding amounts, and colors until you find something that you like. So I'm going to leave mine like this, but you can play around. This link should give you more information, and then you can also, look at more resources or Google things if you want to try different things. But that is that extra enhancement, the fancy headers. So play around with that and have fun. Number 4, 3D images. I'm going to move my face up here for this one. So 3D images, it's easier than you might think to give your images a 3D treatment. Just a clever use of border and box shadow. So click this link and read through box shadow if you've chosen to do this extra enhancement. Pause this video and then come back. Real fast, we're going to scroll back up real fast and look here in our wireframe and see what that shadow looks like on that image. Okay, So start this enhancement by adding a light gray border and some padding to your images. My images had classes of home left image and home right image. So my rule looks like this. So let's look at my HTML. And mine matches that because I have my div with that my image is inside that says home left image, and then my home right one is right here. So that's how I'm going to target them. If yours is different, you'll need to target whatever you have. Okay, so now we're going to target home left image, and then we're going to use a comma so we can target the other one as well with the same declaration. Home right image. So we're going to add the border, 1 pixel, solid, and then the CCC is light gray. And then padding, 10 pixels, which you can pick your own color if you want. So now let's go ahead and look at what that looks like so far. So you can see we have that gray line around the image. And it fits better on this one because this image isn't taking up the right amount of space. So I'm also going to add a property so that both of my images take 100% space. Oop. Let's see what that looks like. That one's still not taking 100%. Oh, I know why. Because, guys, we talked about this earlier in the lesson and I still made the mistake. Because I'm targeting the div and not the image inside of the div. So I'm going to go back, and instead of doing that, I'm going to take that out, copy this because I don't like to type it if I don't have to. And then, so I have the div, and then I want to get the image inside of the div. And I'm going to get rid of this, and then do my width 100%. Let's see how that looks. Okay, see now this one's taking up that full space. Awesome. Okay, so now that I have that all fixed, we can move on to the next part. So if you check that out, we'll begin to see the illusion starting to form. So we just check that out. And then now we have just one last step, which is to add the box shadow in a darker gray. So on the div, we are going to do the box shadow, can't type, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, and then we're going to use the 999, which is a darker gray. And if you don't know what all these are for, you need to check out this link. So pause the video and check that out. Okay, now let's look at what that is looking like. So I can see that we have this nice shadow around it on both of them. So I think it looks awesome. But again, these properties are fair game to experiment with. So you can change how the shadow works. You could change the color of the shadow if you want. If you want a darker gray, a lighter gray, you could even make it a color. For shadows, it usually looks a little better if it's a neutral color, just because that's naturally what a shadow looks like. But you can experiment and play with it however you'd like. And so with that, there's your extra enhancement. And let's move back to the other directions. Okay, step 13, responsive design. Nearly there. Congratulations on making it this far. Your page should be looking great in the browser on your laptop. But what does it look like on a smaller screen like a mobile phone? So let's reduce the width of our browser window to C. Okay, so let's see, I keep making it smaller, and a phone's probably even smaller than this, and it already looks pretty goofy. However, you know, it's still readable, which is good. You know, I can still read the content and see the images. But if someone pulls this site up on their phone, it doesn't look great. So responsive design is a process that most web designers apply to their sites to make them look great on a wide variety of screen sizes. One of the best key parts of responsive design is a media query. These let us change our CSS based on the width of the browser and other things as well. For example, we can make our page responsive by adding a simple media query to it. Add the following to the bottom of your CSS. So let's try this out. Okay, so we have our @media screen, and in parentheses we're going to type max width 550 pixels. And I'll explain to you what this all means in a second. And now within this, so usually we have our selectors here, and then within the brackets we put what we want to do with it. However, we are going to do another selector inside of here. So we have our media query, and then inside of it we're going to put a declaration. So home grid, and we're going to say display block. So real fast, I'm going to show you how this looks before I explain to you what it means, which might be a little backwards, but that's okay. So did you guys see that? Did you guys see? Right now they're all next to each other, and now when I sized it down, they collapsed again. So what did we do? Let me explain. Okay, so basically what we're saying on our media query is we're saying if the max width of the screen gets smaller than 550 pixels, then use this CSS instead of any CSS up here. And not any CSS, but any CSS that disagrees with this. So earlier in the CSS we say home grid display grid, home grid display grid, and so we're saying, but if the screen gets smaller than 550 pixels, then do display block instead. And that's exactly what this is saying. So notice that all I'm changing is I'm turning off grid. And after adding this, the page, when it gets small, the information stacks on top of each other. So it works better for a mobile device or a small screen. So if you're not happy with some of the other things, you can modify those rules as well. So it talks about changing the navigation so that it's also display block instead of display grid. So if we make our screen smaller, which again, my screen's really not getting as small as a phone right now, so the links still look fine like this, but on an actual phone that wouldn't work. And so we could also make that into display blocks so that they stack on top of each other, and then we could do that for the links, and then we could even do that for the entire banner box as well. So you'll want to play with those media queries, play with your screen size, and try to make it look nice on mobile. Responsive web design is really important right now because most people use their phones when they're browsing the internet, so you always want to make your sites mobile responsive. Okay, the last thing that you're going to do is validate both your HTML and your CSS, and then fix any errors. So let's check out mine real fast. So I'm going to open the HTML validator and put in my website link, which is right here. And then wait for it to load. I'm going to validate by the URL. Put it in here. Check. And we'll see if I have any errors. Okay, I don't have any errors, but if I did, I would need to fix them. So real fast, I'm going to put an error in there and just show you. You should know how to validate by now, but that should actually do it. Okay, so if I just click check again, Now I have several errors, and it's all just one error, which is why typically you want to work from the top down. So it says element name P class cannot be represented as XML. So it's like they're saying, I don't know what this element is, which when I look at it, I know that I forgot to put a space between P and class, and that's exactly what happened. But if I didn't, I could also look at the information it's telling me right here, which is from line 41, column 9 to line 41, column 35. So I'm going to look at line 41, which is right here, and I can see there's my error. I will put my space. I'll check it again. Maybe. There we go. And now we have no errors. So you validated your HTML in the past. This week you need to validate your CSS as well. So you can click on the CSS link. And then again, we are going to do it by URL. And check it. And we didn't find any errors. However, you might. And if you find errors, just like with the HTML, you need to look for the line number and find what happened with your CSS. Maybe you forgot a semicolon, maybe you misspelled something, but for this activity you do need to validate your CSS, and you will miss a point if you don't have valid, okay, yeah, so valid HTML and CSS is worth 5 points. Oh, and the page being visually appealing, so really I'll probably only take 1 point off if your CSS is invalid. So watch for that. Okay, and with that we're done. So after that you can go ahead and grab your link and turn it in. Great work.